figuring out how to balance that pace of a thriller with the world building of a space opera or a space adventure. Right? How do you provide enough information to the reader to make this world believable as a secondary universe while keeping them moving forward at that thriller pace? And so I really had to pull back a lot on, oh, but I really want to tell you about these trees. I really want to tell you about this culture and its language. Nope, not here. Save that for the epic space opera.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I'm your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I will be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. Welcome back to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I'm glad that you could join me today for episode 4. We have a great guest today for you, Jonathan Nevair. He is the author of a genre called sci-fi. And if you've never heard of that before, don't worry, you're not alone, because I never heard of it either until I talked to him. But we have a great conversation. We're going to talk to him about the genre, about science fiction in general, about his world building process, and about creating aliens, and his newest novel, Stellar Instinct. Before we get there, a bit of a personal update for you. I do have quite a bit going on this week. First of all, if you happen to be in Kelowna, British Columbia this weekend, I will be there at the Capitol News Centre for the Kelowna Comic Con. And that is August 19th and 20th, 2023, for those of you listening in the future. I have a booth there. I'll be selling and signing books, so come on by and say hi. It would be great to hear from you. I'm also working on the final edits for my book Chimera. Chimera is the second book in my Fractured Orbit series, and that's going to be coming out in October, which is only 7 weeks away now, which is kind of hard to believe. Just about done wrapping up those edits, and then I will be sending copies to my advanced readers. You can pre-order a copy today on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Paperback copies are up for pre-order on those two platforms. You might be able to find them elsewhere as well. Those are the only two I've confirmed right now. All other platforms, the novel should be available shortly in both paperback and in hardcover. So keep an eye on that. I will have information on my personal website, hermanstuernagel.com. You can also find links on the show's website, greatestpodcastinthemultiverse.com. Be sure to check out my Facebook and Instagram pages. You can find both of those at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, please hit the like and subscribe button on whatever podcast app you happen to be listening to this on, or on YouTube. This channel is just getting started, and those actions greatly help me out, and I appreciate all the support that you've provided for me in the last few weeks as the show gets going. So today, as I said, we have Jonathan Nevair on. We had a great conversation. I had a really great chat with him. He is a very intellectual writer. We went into detail about his writing process, and I could have really talked to him for hours. So we will definitely have him back on the podcast. But for now, enjoy our conversation. I will read his bio, and we'll get started with the interview. Jonathan Nevair is a science fiction writer and the pen name for art historian and college professor at a small art and design college in Philadelphia. After 2 decades of academic teaching and publishing, he finally got up the nerve to write fiction. His space opera trilogy, Windtide, was inspired by ancient Greek texts and myths, and released in 2021. Stellar Instinct is a standalone sci-fi adventure in space, and is his latest release, which was December 2022. Jonathan lives in southeastern Pennsylvania with his wife and rambunctious mountain feist, Frigate. When not writing and teaching, he spends his time chasing his dogs through the woods and hoping he'll be able to walk in space before he croaks. Find him online at Nevair. Hello and welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am super excited today to have a very special guest, Jonathan Nevair. Welcome here, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been following Jonathan on social media. We were talking a little bit before the show for a bit of quite a bit of time. Our sci-fi novels have kind of, I think, been on social media at the same time, so we've kind of bumped up against each other in that way. But this is the first time I've had the pleasure of talking to Jonathan face to face. So I'm really happy that you can join me here today.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here, and congrats on the podcast.
Thank you very much. So, Jonathan, why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about your writing journey and what's brought you to this point in your author career?
Sure. So I've been writing science fiction for about 4 or 5 years. Okay. I have a long history of writing and publishing on a more academic side from my other job and my other self. And I've always wanted to write fiction. And I had a couple false starts along the way in my 20s and 30s where I tried out a couple of things, but just never really held and stuck. And then I just reached a point where I finally decided it was time to get down to business and really give it a go. And I think I had reached a point in my other career too where I was looking for a kind of a different approach towards writing that gave me a little more freedom. And working with science fiction and in particular just fiction as opposed to writing sort of research-based nonfiction just gave me that doorway to really do something very different and exciting. And I wrote a book that gave me my literary sea legs and sort of made me understand how to write a book. That was a really bad book. And I put that one aside. And then I wrote my first book that actually is out there, Goodbye to the Sun, which started me off. And then once that happened, I was off to the races. And just, that was it.
Yeah, we seem to have to get that first book out of the way for a lot of writers. I know, like for me, I did publish my first book. Maybe I should have taken a little bit more time before I did, but definitely that's a common story. That first novel often ends up in a desk drawer to collect dust or revisit later, as the case sometimes happens to be.
Yeah, I hear it a lot, actually. Yeah. It does come up quite a bit, yeah. And I'm glad mine's in the drawer. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's like the Ark is back in the warehouse, that's never right. To be seen.
In storage somewhere, absolutely.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. So, what's your other background that you were writing, but not necessarily fiction, if you don't mind sharing that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an art historian, and I teach at a small art and design college in Philadelphia. Okay. So I come out of a very sort of research-based background. Yeah. But, art is such a subjective subject, right, in terms of the way we engage with it, that there's always been a certain amount of freedom in there in terms of especially description. And I think that, the kind of way in which you have to transcribe a visual thing into a written language has benefited me as in my fiction writing too. But it has been very liberating to go from a kind of research-based methodology where I have to rely on evidence, and if the evidence isn't there, you just can't do it, to having the freedom of a fiction approach where you're really speculating. You just have to world build, right, with consistency and convincing sort of innovation.
Right. Yeah. And going from, if you're doing a lot of research in that field, going into something where you're really just where you're creating a world, definitely a different element in there for you.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So how many books do you have out currently?
So I have 4 books currently published. I have a trilogy, which is a epic space opera. That's Windtide, and that's Goodbye to the Sun, Jotty's Wager, and No Song But Silence. And then I have one standalone. It's a hybrid genre. It's basically spy-fi, which is a combination of spy fiction, espionage fiction, thriller, and space adventure and space opera. And that's right. Stellar Instinct.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Stellar Instinct today, because that's your most current release, and it's a lot of fun. So I look forward to chatting a little bit more about that. But first, I'd like to know a little bit more about, what's the motivation behind your storytelling, and what's the why of why you went this way and are pursuing this author career of yours.
Yeah, that's such a great question too. What's the why? I love that. I think that for me, the draw again is with speculative fiction is the simple fact that we can speculate, and I really, for me, am interested in sort of speculating beyond the possible, right? But thinking about that in relationship to the tangible. And it's that kind of tension between, what do we have now? What kind of structures exist, whether they're power structures, whether they're social and cultural structures, whether they're geographic structures, and how can we surpass them? How can we revise them? How can we throw them out and destroy them and start over from them? And what's possible from there? And I really think that's the why for me, is that idea of building those models out and then inhabiting them with characters who can play out ideas. Specifically, I think around ethics. I'm very, very driven by ethics and morality in most of my stories.
Wonderful. That's very well stated. I really enjoy that. Yeah, just the, being able to speculate and getting involved in speculative fiction and bringing that into the tangible. And, I really love that. That's such a great way to put that. So I appreciate that. Yeah. Because it's so true. I think as speculative fiction authors and I think even as readers, we want to, that's what we're looking for. We're looking to use our imagination, but also, to make sense of reality through the fantastical, really.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, that's awesome. What does your writing process look like? On
a good day. It's funny. I recently wrote a short piece called "The Writing is like lasagna." Writing pauses are like lasagna. Just about knowing kind of when you need to step back and let something sit for a bit. Okay. But my writing process, I'm kind of like right in between a planner and a discovery writer, a plotter and a discovery writer. I definitely usually begin with a character. I'm a character-driven writer, so character comes first. Usually a character and some sort of problem or motivation or responsibility. And from there, I usually write a scene out of nowhere. And then I step back from there, and then I try to build out really a larger story. I definitely think in terms of act structures and plot points. I'm very big on story beats. Maybe toying with them a little bit, moving them around, but I'm definitely someone who lays out a roadmap. But what I like to say is that I usually like to have an exit ramp or a destination for a scene, but I have no idea how I'm going to get there.
Okay.
And so it kind of allows for a lot of serendipity, but yet there's still a targeted, I need to get here so that the next plot point or the next moment in the storyline can develop, or the foreshadowing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I tend to be a kind of a scene-based writer. So I'm not like a word count person. Like I have a friend who's a very word count author, and he's like, got my 500 in. For me, it's more like, nope, I need to write this scene.
Okay.
And so I'll go scene by scene. And then the last thing I'll say is that then I'm also a edit as you go. Okay. So I will write a scene. Yeah. I will step back. I'll read it again and flesh it out. I'll read it again and flesh it out. I'll read it again and edit it. I'll read it again and edit it. And then I'll go to the next scene.
Okay.
So by the time I'm done, I'm pretty much at like 90%. And it's a matter of going back and doing work on like, cadence and rhythm and word choices and cleanup.
Yeah, that sounds like a great approach. And I don't know if my
when it works, it is.
That. Yeah.
When it works.
I could pull. I have so many questions from that entire section there. But I want to drill a little bit more into your character process because you said a character comes to you first. How developed is that character when it comes to you? How much are you working that character before you actually put them in a situation?
Yeah, they usually don't have much to them. They kind of just manifest. And, I usually have some sort of like a image of them somewhere, but I don't really understand too much of why until I start writing. And I would say that usually I don't even know much about them by the time that first scene is done. I just know, oh, here you are. You're a person or you're a thing, right? And you're in this place, or you're reflecting, maybe if it's first person or something like that, past, you're reflecting on something that's happened. But I usually, after that, as part of the plotting and planning process, I usually begin to think about wants and needs.
Okay.
And, then there's wonderful moments where like another character it gets introduced that causes conflict with them. And usually it's through that process of writing their engagement that I myself come to realize what a theme is, or right what their wants are and what they're going to need to get by the end.
Okay. Yeah, so you have this kind of a character come to you, and it's really through that writing process that you're getting to know them, and
Yep,
the story kind of builds
absolutely.
around them. That's
Absolutely,
fantastic.
yeah. I'm definitely a kind of like get to know you as I write writer,
Hmm.
as in terms of a character. And sometimes they'll surprise you. You probably know this too, right? Like, oh, where is this going? And like, I used to resist that a lot, and I'd be like,
Hmm.
no, I don't want you to go that way. But the more I write, right, the more I realize like you're telling me to go this way, and I'm almost like the medium.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
you
And I
know,
find too, the more that you kind of resist what the character wants to do, the more off track the story gets.
totally,
And
yeah,
because you've created, once you get those wants and needs, you really, the character really takes on a life of their own, and they kind of
yeah,
are like, no, this is how I would do it. So you better
yep.
come along with me for the
I
ride.
don't want you to do this. Don't do it, right? But it's
Yes.
like, but the story wants you to do it, and it's going to be better for it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. Love it. So what authors have inspired you in your process?
Oh
You
gosh.
kind of have a good. I mean, you have two
Yeah.
series out right now, or a standalone and a series, and
Yep.
they are kind of very different
Yeah.
in what they've done. What authors have inspired you in your work?
So I admit for this question, I made a cheat sheet because I
Hmm.
really had to think about it. So
Yeah.
first and foremost, right off the top of my head, I would say Becky Chambers. There is a way in which Becky Chambers has this gift to write characters that are so normal and so down to earth, yet they're in an extraordinarily different world. And I just really, really gravitate to that, and I look to that as a kind of inspiration. There's a lot of heart and warmth in those characters, and they feel very real. Um, but they don't tip the scale into kind of like sappy or unbelievable. They
Right.
remain sort of tangible to me. Arkady Martin, um, I think, is an author who I'm also in awe of. The kind of the beautiful writing, first of all, and the language of how Martin writes, but also the way that she can express vastness and sort of just like, but with this wonderful subtlety and nuance, and to go from such a small detail to such a big detail. I love that. N.K. Jemisin
Okay.
for voice, like world building, of course, with Jemisin, but voice too. I mean, it's just like, wow. And old school Arthur C. Clarke was my gateway literary drug into science fiction. And really for that kind of like, I always say this when people ask me, but like the sublime cosmos, just right. That way he can give you that like
Yeah.
wonder
Yeah.
and awe, right? I mean, it's like, it makes me, how do you write like something where you imagine this minute little spaceship against this vast stellar blanket? Like, love
Definitely.
that. Martha Wells, I only have two more, but Martha Wells,
Okay.
Murderbot series, the brevity, like how do
Mhm.
you do such lean writing, right? And the snark, love it.
Yeah.
And lastly, I'll say David Gemmell, to go fantasy. Gemmell's tragic characters, I really gravitate towards. I like the way Gemmell writes heroism with a kind of a flawed tragedy to it.
Okay.
Is really powerful to me. That's my
Fantastic.
short list,
Fantastic short
believe
list.
it or
Yeah,
not.
that's fantastic.
But
And I think that's, that's a wide range of influence, and that's great because you have so many elements that you can pull from each of those
yeah,
examples into your writing, and different examples too. I mean, I'm actually reading now The Lonely, or Long Journey to a Small Angry Planet by Becky
mm-hmm.
Chambers, and I know I butchered that title, but
Long way to small angry planet. Yeah,
well, yeah, that's the one. And yeah, I'm really enjoying it. But to and
yeah,
then to pull someone like Arthur C. Clarke or N.K. Jemisin into there, those are vastly different writers. But if you
totally.
can pull
Yep.
pieces of that inspiration into your own work,
Yeah,
or into what you're inspired by, that is a good collection.
yeah. I hope you enjoy it. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. I also like
Yeah.
the new two novellas are wonderful too. The Monk and Robots. They're
Yeah,
really great.
I've listened to the first one
Yeah,
recently
it's
as well,
great.
and it's wonderful. It
I
really
did it on
is.
audio as well, and it was wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so warm and cozy. Like, I mean, they are cozy sci-fi, and it's
Yeah.
there's a lot of inspiration in them as well. So
Yeah, and I think that just to kind of round back a little bit, like that's what I think I really like about it is you don't sacrifice a kind of a stronger philosophy and theme but at the same time you hold on to the cozy, like the ecological themes in that Monk and Robot are so wonderful, and they're there in the discourse right next to the kind of the down to earth coziness and that homeliness connected with that is a really amazing thing.
It really is, yeah. Well crafted for sure. All right, well, let's talk about your book. Can you tell us about Stellar Instinct and what is it all about?
So Stellar Instinct is basically, it is a secret agent thriller adventure set in a galactic empire, set in a galactic empire. So multi-species galactic empire. So it features a agent named Laline Renault, who works for an organization called GAMOPS, which is Galactic Agency Maintaining Order, Peace, and Security. I had to think about that acronym for a minute. And it is very much a sort of a kind of a James Bond style or a Mission Impossible style secret agent story, but set in this sort of far future galactic environment, which gives a lot of interesting possibilities. But the story follows her on a mission where she has to confront a kind of a really puzzling tension between reality and virtual reality against an entertainment tycoon. And it turns out that there's larger cosmic forces at work and some very interesting ongoing mysteries that need to be uncovered. And she and her team, which you would expect a typical kind of tropey team for a secret agent story, have to do their best to stop him.
Yeah, okay. Very cool. And so I know we talked a little bit about your author inspirations, but what was kind of the inspiration behind this story in particular?
So I've always been a big fan of secret agent thrillers and assassin stories and whatnot growing up. And I guess I always wanted to write one. But I don't write primary world fiction. I don't actually read a lot of primary world fiction either. I very much love fantasy and science fiction that is set in secondary worlds. It's just kind of what draws me. And so I thought to myself, I really want to write a spy thriller, and I've got all these ideas, and I feel like I know the genre so well because I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, sort of when there was this long-running spate of them, and then Mission Impossibles happened, and Atomic Blonde, which I absolutely love. And I thought, I really want to do this, but I want to write in the secondary world. And so the solution was, well, let's just do the both of them. And it turned out there was a subgenre that was already there called spy-fi, which basically is sort of looking to more future technologies, but in a more like a Cold War environment. But I just kind of appropriated that same concept in a secondary universe.
Okay. Yeah, and it's a subgenre that I wasn't familiar with really before I came across your work, and the only thing I could compare it to was like Cowboy Bebop or something, but that's not even really it, right? So,
but that was a really big influence on me too. I had just watched the new version, right around the time I was writing this, and absolutely, it was an inspiration.
Okay. That's great. Yeah, because that's, when I was like, what is this even like? It's like this, but not kind of. But yeah, so it's great to hear that was an inspiration.
That's a super compliment you just gave me, so I'll take it.
Fantastic. So, can you, I know you talked a little bit about spy-fi, but can you tell us a little bit more about, how it kind of fits in with space? Like, is there kind of a niche within spy-fi that's, the space-based part of it?
There's a little bit, so there's people like Dan Moran who wrote a series that was very much a Cold War galactic spy-fi. The Bayern Agenda is the first book in that series. And that was a really good example of someone sort of taking a really classic Cold War era sort of spy thriller and dropping it into a galactic universe. Just out now, Megan O'Keefe has written a book called The Blighted Star. Is that it? The Blighted Star, I think. I haven't read it yet, but familiar. That features a spy also in space. Okay. But there aren't exactly too many of them.
Okay.
There's a lot more out there, but it's not something that has a lot to it. You get a lot of detectives, a lot of xenoarchaeologists who end up on missions that are very much like a secret agent might take on, but a more standard. And not, I'll make a distinction. There's a difference between an espionage thriller and a secret agent thriller.
Okay.
So
what are the differences there?
Well, they're subtle, but an espionage thriller is going to be something like you might get with a Le Carre book, right? Like you're going to have an agency that's involved with intelligence, right? They're going to have operatives in the field, but it's going to be a much more nuanced cloak and dagger, mystery-based, usually thriller that involves, information and asset, usually a file or something that needs to be gotten. There's a lot of political double dealing and confusion in that sense. Whereas I think the secret agent style thriller is much more of your sort of, what I guess comes out of like a James Bond, Ian Fleming, Jason Bourne, right? It's like the lone character given an assignment by their authoritative, right, organizational figure. They have help, with technology, but really at a certain point, they're going to go it alone in the big showdown between the enemy, and there's going to be spectacular action scenes, and that's going to lead you to some sort of big finish by the end.
Yeah. So and it's such a spectacular, and it almost seems like an obvious crossover to do. Like, there's such a big, the Jason Bourne and Jack Ryan and that sort of that sort of narrative, putting it into a space setting just seems like the natural fit, but it just hasn't happened too much.
I know. I mean, Hollywood needs to call us on the Red Scrambler and I mean, seriously, but I agree, right? I mean, there aren't that many.
I know there's some other subgenres that you've worked into the novel as well. Yeah. How did you work with tropes and kind of meeting reader expectations, coming into kind of a different cross of subgenres, but still, giving them something that was somewhat familiar that they would be able to latch onto?
Yeah, and this kind of feeds into a discussion about like balancing the kind of world building of science fiction and space opera with something like a thriller that needs to have that paciness. But in terms of the genres, I think, and building it in, from a structural perspective, what I really did was I sort of took a 3-act structure that you might use for a space opera.
Okay.
Or anything that you might write in a secondary galactic universe. And then I looked particularly to the story beats that you would expect to see in a thriller, particularly in a spy thriller. And I tried to think about sort of bringing the story beats of a thriller into a 3-act structure that's set in space.
Okay.
That's the best way I can put that.
Yeah.
So, you've got these expected beats and also tropes, right, that you're going to want or expect to see in a espionage story or a secret agent story. And those had to be integrated in there.
Okay. So what kind of tropes, I guess, without getting into too much of a, spoiler territory, but what kind of tropes can readers expect in Stellar Instinct?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if these would qualify as tropes, these things, but you're going to get things like you're going to get red herrings. You're going to get MacGuffins, right? You're going to get misdirection based off of those, right? You're going to get moments where you're going to get these incredible twists, right, that are going to turn the plot line. But you're also going to get some standard tropes that you're going to expect to see. Like, you're going to have the opening action sequence, right, where the main character is going to demonstrate their amazing abilities, right? You're going to have the authoritative figure where there's a tension in their relationship, but nevertheless, there is a certain point where you're going to get a kind of a flurry of investigations that's going to eventually lead to something congealing enough that it's going to become a official assignment. You're going to have the helpers, whether they're, in this case, the tech gadget wizard people, right? Or people in the field, right, who are your resource assets. And, you see this a lot in all of these kinds of films. And then there's going to be the scene, usually where you're going to expect this. There's going to be the confrontation with the arch villain. There's going to be, this is a big one. You get the monologue, right?
Right.
Like I always tell people, if they want to know what the tropes are for a secret agent story, watch Austin Powers.
It's true. Wow, that is true.
It's a parody. I mean, it's in a way it's a parody of that, and it really does just go over the top with them. And it will show them to you, but you're going to get the monologue, right? You know, and then you're going to get the showdown, and the ticking clock, right? These are things that you have to have.
That's so fantastic that you point that out about Austin Powers, because now it's like, of course, that's what it is. That's 100% what it is.
100% what it is.
That's what makes it funny.
Yeah, that's what makes it funny. He's just being hyperbolic with a lot of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, and definitely that's. I mean, what you described there is James Bond in space, right? Like it's
the one thing, if I could just throw a little caveat on it, the one thing I will say is one of the problems I encountered when I was doing a lot of research and reading on thrillers, especially secret agent or superhero type narratives, is you often have a flat character arc. And this was a concern for me. Because it's like they come into the story, they have all their abilities, and it's really about what you're going to put in front of them, right? And are they going to be able to, conquer it? And that bothered me as a character-driven writer. I wanted that wants and needs thing in there. And so what I did was I developed a kind of a subplot where the Lane is a struggling poet.
Okay.
She's sort of like a bad poet, but wants to be a good poet. And so I wanted that there so that I could kind of balance out the idea of you're incredible at this one thing you do, but you're not very good at this, but you want to be. And so you have a complex about it, you know, and you have these wants. And, you know, I wanted that kind of there. And as I wrote the book, it actually did this wonderful thing where it kind of like wove together with the main narrative in a way, but it gave a little bit of I felt like an arc of development to the character that wouldn't have otherwise been there.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that too, because I mean, James Bond is kind of the textbook when you're talking about character arcs. He's your textbook flat character arc. So
yeah, totally.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up and to differentiate that, because that, I mean, if you're, like you said, a character-based writer, you know, you do want some sort of arc for your character. So
absolutely,
that's great.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about the world that you created, and what was the most difficult part of creating the world?
Yeah, so the world is very much like, you know, if I was to generalize it, it is very much like a Star Wars universe. It has a very Andor feel. Okay. So it's a multi-species universe. So it's, you know, it has FTL. It's a soft science fiction universe. Things just work. You know, people can just jump in things and shoot off from here to there. Blasters just do what they do. I don't explain why or how. Again, it's the character side that's more interesting to me. And, you know, I think that the two difficult things that I encountered, the first difficult thing was figuring out how to balance that pace of a thriller with the world building of a space opera or a space adventure. Right? How do you provide enough information to the reader to make this world believable as a secondary universe while keeping them moving forward at that thriller pace? And so I really had to pull back a lot on, but I really want to tell you about these trees. Right. I really want to tell you about this culture and its language. Nope, not here. Save that for the epic space opera. And then the other thing is I'd never written aliens before. So this was the first time that I actually wrote a non-human based sort of, or a world with more than just humans in it, in space. And that was a challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so what was challenging about that for you? Like, what did you find the most difficult?
Well, I mean, first of all, just having to, you know, on the basic level, just kind of having to invent variants on humans or completely new species and not be, you know, cliche about it. And trite about it, right? Like, you know, you don't want to default to what's out there. Mm-hmm. And then I really got into and started enjoying the possibilities of the speculative aspect of that. But, you know, there's so many things to be really cautious about. You don't want to become anthropocentric, right? And like impose human limitations on non-human species. And so it was hard. It was really hard. And, describing things, I needed to be really careful with my language. I found myself at times falling in implicitly to like talking about, relationships of anatomy between species in a way that was kind of centering from a human perspective.
Right.
I could decenter myself.
Yeah, that would be difficult. And, I don't have aliens in my writing either, but I mean, now that you're, talking about all those things, like, that would actually...
So I'm going to do it. A good friend of mine who's an author and a poet, Jean-Paul Garnier, who runs Space Cowboy Books, he gave me the challenge after my Windtide series. He was like, I'm challenging you to write aliens. So Herman, I'm challenging you to write aliens.
Thank you. Yeah, and they will, I'm sure in a future series they will be. My current series is kind of set in our solar system, and it's really, a human-based dystopian empire. But yeah, definitely not off the table for me.
I commend you for that too, because there's something that to me is very intimidating about writing in our solar system, just because you have to justify and connect, right, to Earth history.
Yeah, it's it has been an interesting process, but I've been enjoying it as well too. So trying, you kind of have to keep things within the realm of reality somewhat, like because you're here, right? So there has to be some basis for it, but it has its own set of challenges. So speaking about the language that you created, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of your scenes you wrote in a second person point of view, which is something that as authors we're often told, don't do that.
I know.
So I know. And I have read Stellar Instinct. I don't think I had mentioned that previously, but you did I think a great job in handling the second person point of view. So what was kind of your thought process behind that, and how did you approach that? How did that that come about?
Yeah, I have a history of doing some weird POV stuff that's a little bit sort of a no-no, like slap on the wrist. So like my first book was alternated every chapter between first and third, between two characters. My second book had an interior imaginary friend that alternated between first and third. So I've done some weird stuff before. So I was a little comfortable doing it. But in this case, it was totally driven by gaming. And by how, when you work with, whether you're doing like tabletop role playing, right, and you're looking in, let's say, a campaign guide, it's usually written in second person, right?
Yes, right.
So you enter this dungeon and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking about, well, I want to write these scenes that are virtual reality, where the character is literally inside of a virtual reality. And I thought, well, I could do it in third, but I kind of wanted to make the reader really feel like they were inside of that space. And so I took a chance and I rolled the dice and I thought, okay, for these scenes, you're going to be the character. And when I say you, because I thought about it, I could have used like she, right, or he. Yeah. And then I thought, well, that pulls the reader away. And I thought, I'm going to do it. And I decided to use the you. You walk into the boardroom. And, I think it worked. I mean, some people, have problems with it. It's a little jarring. But a lot of people, some people it was weird. Some people, I was like, what do you think of the second person? They were like, oh, I didn't even notice it. I was like, what? And other people were like, oh, I really liked it. I thought it worked, But that was really the motivation, was sort of driven off of gaming and the fact that gaming uses second person.
Right.
And then thinking about virtual reality and wanting to immerse the reader so they really felt like I lifted them out of the story world that's supposed to be physical and put them into it like virtual world.
Right. Yeah. And I think, the situations that you used it in, definitely worked in that context. And I love the way that you explain that, because it does work in that situation. As soon as you mentioned gaming and how that is in the second person, then it definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So, tell me about your favorite character in Stellar Instinct and what makes them special to you.
Yeah, this is like one of those questions, like, well, they're all my favorite characters. So, I'm going to answer it this way and say, who's my favorite to write?
Yes.
Right? Okay. Because, obviously Lillian is the main character, so, like, she's going to have a really important place for me. But I would say the character of Pin, who is a Otari, which is a four-armed winged creature, an usual species in the galaxy, rare to join the sort of larger civilized components separate from their own sort of worlds. Pin was the most fun to write because Pin challenged my abilities of just thinking about social dynamics, because I really wanted to incorporate a character that had a very different social dynamic, where the kind of standards of etiquette or expectations of how we engage with one another conversationally and even bodily just was different, but wasn't different because they were being rude or because they were ignorant. It was different simply because in their world it's different. Right. And it ended up being such a fun thing because the reactions that I was able to generate back from the other characters really, it opened a kind of a fun play on thinking about what it must be like to engage with people who are so different. So like Becky Chambers, it takes me back there, like Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, like just thinking about how you're on this ship with all these different species, right? Yes, exactly. And there's those moments of misunderstanding that continuously happen, right? With Chef or something, right? And it's like, you know, and it's like that. Those are wonderful little moments that I think reveal so much about world building. Mm-hmm. And so I really liked writing Pin. Pin was really fun.
Yeah, and that's, you know, and yeah, as you were talking, like, yeah, that is like Becky Chambers. I had the exact same thing in my head.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have that flexibility, you know, when you're writing species that are new, that you can think about how we might interact and how they might interact with other species, and how cultural differences will, you know, our own biases reflect in our reaction to those things.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Wonderful.
Yep.
You know, and I think every single person I've asked that question so far, it always picks a side character. It's never,
right?
Oh yeah, my main character is great, but I really love this side character because you get to play with them a bit more.
I was going to say, you're so right. Yeah, because that's what's so great about side characters, right? It's like you can be more loosey goosey.
Yeah,
totally. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not confined to, you know, the plot that you need them to follow.
You need them to follow. You can like, oh, they can do this, like this unexpected thing. I definitely agree with you. Yeah.
And they're also the ones that shake things up for the main character. And
oh yeah, absolutely.
I love it. So what can readers expect as they read your book? What kind of emotional impact do you hope to have on the reader?
Wow. I like close third when I write in third. So I really try to put you into the character. And as a result of that, I really hope that you're feeling and experiencing all of the frustrations, the tensions, the joys with the character. But the one thing that I would say that really is important to me, which often isn't a word you hear a lot when we talk about the craft of writing, is mood.
Okay.
I am really big on mood. And I think to create a mood, you have to really integrate personality of a character, the setting, right? The problem of what's happening. It all kind of has to work together. And in doing that, it creates a kind of an atmosphere or a mood. So I really like trying to do that. So readers can expect to get, hopefully, if it works, a kind of a really strong feeling of place and where someone is and what it's like to be in that place.
Okay.
And that might be a good feeling. It might be a bad feeling. It might be a tense feeling, right? Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, pulling all the elements together, and yeah, love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So what are you working on now? What can readers expect from you next?
So I'm writing another standalone Agent Renault adventure, spy-fi adventure. It's called To Spy a Star. And it will be out actually December 5th. I'm about almost 70% done at this point as of today. So I'm shooting to finish within about a month.
That's exciting.
Yeah, and it's it's a standalone too. So it's going to be a completely separate book. I'm hoping to create a series of these, almost like a Bond style sequence where it's like you can read them, pick them up in any order.
Right. That is such a a Bond-esque title too. I love it.
To Spy a Star. There's so much that goes into titles, right? It's like,
yes.
Yeah. But yes, it is a very Bond title, I guess.
But I love it. It fits the genre. So
right. It kind of takes both of them, right? Yeah. Spy and Star. And
yeah, you know what you're getting when you pick up that book. I love it.
It took a long timer.
Wonderful. So time for our last question, which is my favorite question to ask my guests. This is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. So can you tell me how, in a parallel universe, a different choice might have shaped another version of your life?
Such a great question. I would say that probably I would have really liked, had I had it to do again, to ended up doing something around oceanography.
Really?
I have a real love for the ocean and the sea. I grew up along the water. Mm-hmm. I feel very at home in the water. And, when I was a kid, Jacques Cousteau was like a hero of mine.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and I think something to do with oceanography would have been a really interesting other direction for me to go in.
Wonderful. So is that something that, that you still kind of hangs on to your interest on the side? Is that something you still kind of follow along as, if you have a chance? I know I know things are busy, but
not really. I thought long and hard about this too, actually, because you gave it to me ahead of time, and it was a really hard question to answer, because it was like, gosh, what would I want to do? But I don't really pursue it other than I just, there's such a joy that I get from being in the water.
Right.
And whether it's in a deep sea situation or along the ocean shore, I just connect. And so I think having the ability to work in that environment and be in that environment would be really exciting.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you once again, Jonathan, for joining me. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you and the best way that they can get a hold of your books?
Sure. So my books are on Amazon, and my audiobooks are wide, and you can find me at www.jonathannevair.com, and that's Jonathan with an N and then another N on Nevair. I am also on social media, basically everywhere, at jnevair. And usually that's Twitter, Instagram. I'm also just now on Substack. I have a blog there. And that's basically the short of it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you once again for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to my interview with Jonathan Nevair. I hope you enjoyed that. Jonathan is so full of wisdom and writing advice, as well as he really has an introspective way of looking at his writing. So I really enjoyed that. I will be having him on again. We'll arrange some dates, possibly around the time his new release comes out, to Spy a Star. Next week, please join me as I welcome A.E. Kincaid, and we talk about humorous fantasy. It's a bit of a different spin, but I had a great time with Amy, and I know you'll enjoy that interview as well. So hit the like and subscribe buttons and join me next week. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again. Bye now. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the show, like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, you can help support the show by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can get early access to the show, as well as submit your questions for my upcoming guests. I hope to see you next time. Bye now.